Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. We start out in the direction of Robotina, where the Russians have managed to make a small advance in the direction of the Ukrainian fortified positions along the highway here in the direction of Yevhenivka and Hrodivka. The Russians have been continuing positional fighting in the Robotina section of the front line since the end of the Ukrainian summer offensive. And since then, it has slowed down significantly, with the Russians only having this singular advance in the first week of July and no other changes in the front line. We do see that fighting is taking place in the north of Robotina near the next line of defense of the Ukrainians. If the Russians capture that line of defense, then they will have evened out and properly secured the village of Robotina here in this section of the front line and pushed the Ukrainians back to almost the same positions as they started in. If the Russians had control over this area right here, then their front line would be as it was. And we see that capturing these fortified positions is halfway done. And then there's only two fortified positions ahead of that, which means that the final part is practically insignificant. It was simply minefields with no significant Russian presence ahead of the Ukrainian summer offensive. In the next section of the front line, here in the direction of Hrodivka, the Russians have advanced in the central parts of the city, managed to enter the forest area here in the central parts, and positional fighting continues both in the center, east, and west in the entirety of the Hrodivka section of the front line. The focus of the Russian army here is to move slowly across the central parts of Hrodivka towards the northern parts along the marsh area by the river line. Gaining control over this area here by pushing through would completely cut off the Ukrainian supply line to the eastern part of the city. And that is at any point in this area here. If the Russians reach the end in any of this section here, it would completely cut off the supplies going to and from the eastern parts of Hrodivka for the Ukrainian armed forces. So we see heavy fighting is mainly focused in the western side of the city, both in the central and western part, as the Russians are looking and testing the Ukrainian defenses in the area to push towards the end. Moving further north in the Hrodivka section of the front line, the Russians have made a small advance within Yevhenivka, where they are moving in the direction of the Ukrainian fortified position north of the village. We see here that the Ukrainian objective is to slowly move in the direction of the fortified position, moving through the residential area of the village and then gaining control of it both from an assault to the north and to the east. The objective here would be to move along the river line towards the fortified positions, capturing those which would allow the Russians to then enter into Vovche from the south and along the railways to the north towards Pokrovsk. The Ukrainians here are launching counterattacks with the 47th Mechanized Brigade at the spearhead. We see that with this geolocated footage here of a Ukrainian Bradley infantry fighting vehicle fighting against Russian positions here by Yevhenivka, after which it was hit by an FPV drone, which rendered it destroyed. The situation near the Hrodivka section of the front line has changed in nature. It started out with the Russians' capture of Hrodivka, which led to the positional fighting as the Ukrainians were on the retreat. However, the Ukrainians managed to hold back the Russians along the river line, with Berdishi, Semenivka, the western outskirts of Hrodivka, and Umanske holding out for quite a while. During this process, the Russians managed to break through in the north, where they kept attacking, capturing Robotina, and then yet again attacking the Ukrainians while on the run, capturing Arkhangelsk, Novokalinovo, Keremik, Novoalexandrivka, and so on, moving in every single direction. But now the Ukrainians have managed to somewhat stabilize their fronts. They're no longer on the run, which means that the Ukrainians are able to establish their front line along this river line here and connecting it to the north by Losovatsky. So therefore, we see that there is this connection with the Ukrainian defensive positions. However, the Russians are right at the gates, which means that if the Russians manage to launch another breakthrough, they'll be hitting the Ukrainians on the run again, and we may see a continuation of the current situation, where the Russians are currently working on Novoslivka Persha. If they manage to bypass it and cut off its supplies to the west of the town, and combine that with an assault here northwest of Umanske, they'll be able to completely cut off Novoslivka Persha, and they'll be back on breaking through the Ukrainian defensive lines. They manage to cut off and go through the next Ukrainian line of defense, then they'll be able to return to the previous fighting where they had had a lot of success, and that is attacking Ukrainian positions where they're weakest ahead of them preparing or properly preparing their defensive positions. The Russians are currently closing in on the border of the Hrodivka section of the front line towards the Pokrovsk section of the front line, and in a northern direction towards the Konstantinivka section of the front line. With the current situation, we see that the main focus of the Russians is here along Hrodivka to the south, the river line of the Vovcha River here in the center, and in the north by Novoalexandrivka towards the highway between Pokrovsk and Konstantinivka. The main focus of the Russians here is two sections. The railways here in the center and Novoslivka Persia in the south, where the Russians are moving along the river line. So we see that in both of these areas, the Russians have been advancing on a wide front rather than a spearhead, and in the direction of Novoslivka Persia, it is a spearhead rather than a wide front. This is all connected with this recent advance. We have one common engagement of the Russians where they are pressuring the Ukrainians on a wider front, preventing the Ukrainians from launching any counterattacks because they have to constantly deal with the Russian offensive in both directions. And the Russians have properly secured their flanks by capturing Novoalexandrivka to the north and Umansk to the south. This means that the Ukrainians do not have any flanks to attack. It is very difficult for them to launch a proper counterattack with the current situation due to how wide the front line is. If the Ukrainians launch a counterattack and recapture Novoalexandrivka, then the Russians still have numerous fortified positions, the railway line, Robotina in the heights, and so on, to defend against the Ukrainian onslaught. Therefore, the Ukrainians have a very difficult time to actually launch counterattacks, and the Russians are continuously on the offensive. The tide has not been able to be turned by the Ukrainians since the capture of Hrodivka, and this has led to numerous advances by the Russians capturing the entirety of this area. In the direction of New York and Hrodivka, we see the Russian objective here is ahead of a push from Hrodivka towards Konstantinivka. They are improving their positions to the east. Whether it is to redirect Ukrainian forces from the north of Hrodivka towards Toretsk and New York, or if it is simply to bypass the Ukrainian defensive lines along the highway by moving through the residential areas and the urban areas here into the east. I'm not really sure, but what we do see is it is a well thought out and well planned attack that have managed to break through Ukrainians' initial lines of defense, and heavy fighting is taking place for the Russians to reach the central parts of New York and Toretsk, and they've met a lot of success due to the Ukrainian forces being spread thinly across the front. If this is able to meet with much more success and they manage to capture New York to the south and Toretsk to the northeast, they'll be able to securely launch offensive operations towards Konstantinivka from the south. Unlike the northeast in the direction of Chasiv Yar, the Ukrainians would have no more heights to protect their defensive positions, will not have any defensive lines or proper defensible positions like the canal line that the Ukrainians have near Chasiv Yar. Therefore, the Russians would be able to push towards Konstantinivka, and this will force the Ukrainians to do one of two things: either flank the Russian positions by counterattacking in the direction of New York and Toretsk, which would be difficult due to the defensible positions that they are in, or to withdraw from these frontline positions to defend the city from the north. To prevent all of this, they are simply sending additional reinforcements to New York and Toretsk. However, with the Russian initial breakthrough, it is difficult for the Ukrainians to establish defensive lines in the New York direction. In the Toretsk direction, they have the defensive line, which they're currently using. However, again, this is difficult to properly defend due to the Russian breakthrough in the Druzhba direction, going across the first line of defense and the second line of defense by flanking it from the north. So we see that the Russians have pretty much put a huge issue into the Ukrainian defensive lines and making it difficult for them to establish one proper one in the Toretsk and New York direction. Therefore, the Ukrainian lines are unstable in that direction as of now. Until they properly establish defensive positions, it is likely that the Russians could take advantage of that by pushing with another one. Therefore, the current main axis of attack of the Russians is here in the Chasiv Yar and then down to Hrodivka direction of the front line, where the Russians have their main focus in the central parts of the Donetsk region. Further north in the direction of Kupiansk, there is the small advance by the Russians here to the east of Sinkivka. We've seen positional fighting by the Russians here to the east of Sinkivka at the end of last month and the start of this one, where the main focus is here to the east of Sinkivka, northeast of Petropavlivka, as the Russians are slowly moving across the forest lines and open fields in this area. Secure the front line, moving it slightly forward towards the direction of Petropavlivka to attack it from the east, or simply to weaken the Ukrainian positions by Sinkivka. By pushing the front line along it, it is difficult for the Ukrainians to concentrate much of their forces here in the west due to the looming threat of an offensive to the east, and the Ukrainians would be forced to spread out their forces here on a wider front instead of concentrating it in the Sinkivka direction, which could lead to more advances by the Russians, whether it is within the village itself or in the forest area west of it. And that is all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.